Hey everybody, Steph here. So let's talk about simplicity. Now, I've spoken about simplicity in the past, how important it was to keep your code simple. Simplicity is one of those universal principles that, I don't know, I guess people take it for granted, but let me give you a quick few examples about where I've seen simplicity in systems play itself to be true. The first place I observed it was in martial arts. I did martial arts for nearly 30 years, maybe a little bit more than 30 years, depending on how you want to look at it. And what I discovered in martial arts is that you have simple systems and you have complex systems. And the simple systems tend to stick to the basics more. They tend to work on the basic things that make people good fighters, that actually make people good fighters. Then you have the more complex systems, the more academic systems, where they concentrate a lot on theory and tons of techniques and tons of principles. They don't get down to fighting too much. You know, these are martial arts. But they get caught up in all these drills and all these forms and sets, and they can become very elaborate. And I can tell you from my 3 decades or so of training, and I've done a lot of ring fighting, and I was a bouncer. I can tell you from my experience, in fact, that the people who do best in reality in fighting are the people who are in the simpler systems. The simpler systems always work better. The complex systems kind of entertains your mind, but then you realize that a lot of these complex martial arts systems, they lose sight of what makes a good fighter, and they go down these weird paths and tangents that take them nowhere. And they're convinced that they're great fighters, trust me, but then they actually get into a fight and they take a beating, and then they're wondering why they take a beating, then they come up with all kinds of excuses, and then they still think they have the best system. So it's craziness. I remember I had a friend of mine who was in one of these complex systems, and he told me, he said, well, in the beginning, the first 5, 10 years, we're not nearly as good as the other guys, but because of our system is so good, and after 20 years, we are the best. So that's kind of like, that's, I think anybody who's not brainwashed in the circumstance realizes how silly that sounds. So let's look at simplicity again versus complexity. My first business I started in the 90s. It was not technology. And what we discovered, we had centralized filtration systems. I won't get into the details, but basically tanks connected together through plumbing. And what we discovered, it was that again, simple systems, simple plumbing systems work the best. We tried a few times putting together a very elaborate system, huge systems. We figure huge is better, right? Bigger is better, it's more centralized. That's the argument. It doesn't work out that way. It is far more complex, far more difficult to maintain a complex system, to build a complex system, and it's just not worth it. You're much better off with simple, or at best medium complex systems. Same thing with businesses. You look at business. You hardly ever see innovation from a huge business. The exception is occasionally with Apple's, when Steve Jobs would pull out the small team of people away from the rest of the company so that they could work freely. Essentially, they could work like a small business. All the innovations come from the small businesses most of the time, so the big businesses buy up the small businesses. There's a reason for that, because big, huge, monolithic systems are slow to change, slow to adapt. And of course, when you got people who are working in big systems, they don't like too much change. That's why they're in large organizations. That's why they're in, that's why they're in large organizations. That's why government is the last group to actually change or realize the change in things. It takes people to change government. Government doesn't make changes, typically. And this is not a political position, this is just an observation on my part. So let's bring this all back to code. Same thing with code. The most nimble apps are the smallest apps, the simplest code, the simplest base of code. Less programmers on there, the better. I discovered when when StudioWeb was actually back in the 90s, was a web development studio, StudioWeb. And I discovered you had more than 3 people on a particular project. The overhead increased quite a bit in terms of managing the group, and you just saw efficiency drop. So the optimum number of people working on a particular project, to me, well, from my experience, was about 3. So keep that in mind. Anyhow, so there's a few examples of simplicity. I hope you find this useful, and we'll talk soon. Cheers.